With all that said, now it's time to talk about the most misunderstood part of the history of the church. And you wrote a whole book about this, The Glory of the Crusades. When the World Trade Center was attacked in New York, the Crusades were often mentioned as the basis for Islamic fury. And former presidents of the United States have spoken about it, including Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. So during the Crusades, Steve, is it true that Christian armies once do the same things that we criticize radical members of Islam for today? For the record, can you give us the real story of the Crusades?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll try to do it here in a couple of
Yes.
minutes. I do, I do. As you mentioned, I wrote a whole book on it, and I do teach an entire semester, long course on the Crusade. So, but no, yeah, there's a lot of the issue with the Crusades. Let me start with this: the issue with the Crusades in our world today, right? Especially since September 11th, of 2001, as you
Yeah.
mentioned, is that there is widespread recognition of the term
Mm.
Crusades, but there is very little appreciation or understanding for what the crusading movement historically was.
Mm.
Like you can pull 100 people off the street anywhere here in the U.S. or probably throughout the world, frankly, in many places, and say, have you ever heard of the term Crusades? And I guarantee you, the vast majority of people would say, yeah, I've heard the term. And then you ask them, well, what is the Crusades? They'll probably paint a picture something like this, right? That the Crusades were launched by a Christian Europe as a with these barbaric warriors who traveled thousands of miles away from their home to kill
Mm.
peaceful loving Muslims
Mm.
in North Africa and the Holy Land, completely unprovoked, completely offensive in nature, motivated more than likely by wealth, by greed,
Mm.
by colonialism, by desire to establish colonies and what have you. And all that description is 100% false, right?
Mm.
There was nothing in the way of the Crusades as being any kind of offensive operation. The understanding of the Crusaders who went from Europe, starting from the very beginning of the crusading movement at the end of the 11th century. Well, before I get there, we should probably stop just for a second and
Yeah.
understand that when we say the term crusading movement, it
Uh.
it evolved over time, right? So
Mm.
most people, when you say the word crusade or crusading movement, they think of the 8 traditionally numbered campaigns stretching from the 11th century all the way to the 13th century
Mm.
against Muslims in North Africa and the Holy Land. But the historian in me has to say that the crusading movement occupied many different areas of the world, if you will, many different forms as
Mm.
well, and it was a movement that lasted nearly 600 years. So it evolved over
Wow.
time. Yeah, it evolves
Uh.
over time, right? So, but if we're looking at just the ones that lasted from the 11th century to the 13th century in North Africa and the Holy Land, these were campaigns called for by the Pope to help liberate ancient Christian territory, which had been conquered by various Islamic armies over the century from the rise of Islam in the 7th century. They began in the 11th century, primarily because of the arrival of a group of people known as the Seljuk Turks, who came down out of the Asian
Mm.
steppe
Mm.
into what is now modern-day Turkey. At the time was
Mm.
the Eastern Roman imperial province of Anatolia. And they took over that province. Eventually, they won a big battle in 1071 against the Eastern Roman Empire. And then the Eastern
Uh.
Roman Emperor sent representatives to the West, to the Pope in particular, asking for military aid. And so the beginning of the Crusades
Mm.
really
Mm.
was a response to this request for military aid to defend Christian territory. Pope Urban II jumped on that request, if you will, and he expanded it and made the
Mm.
objective of the campaign to be the liberation of the Holy City of Jerusalem.
Mm.
Because there were reports leading up to that time period of pilgrims leaving Western Europe, going to the Holy Land and being attacked and being killed
Mm.
by the Seljuks and other Muslim groups in the area at the time. There was also reports of indigenous Christians and Jews living in those areas who were also being harassed and killed. And so this was
Mm.
in the minds of those who participated, these Christian warriors, it was an armed pilgrimage that was penitential in nature, that was
Mm.
defensively and part of a just war in order to defend those who were being attacked, Christians who were being attacked, as well as to recover property, territory that had once been Christian, all of which meets the criteria under the just war theory, if you will. So that's how
Mm.
what they saw they were doing.
Mm.
And that's how I think how we have to understand it. And it's the most historical way to understand those events.
Mm. There's one video that I saw that convinced me that the Crusades are necessary, and it's a video of the world map of how religions has spread throughout the centuries. And you can see there that at the end of the first millennium, Christianity has already spread throughout Europe and Africa, but Islam conquered a big chunk of it. And the land was taken back by crusaders, but nothing compared to the land conquered by Islam. It's only a little chunk of land that was taken back by the crusades.
Yeah, absolutely. And it didn't even last very long, frankly. I mean, most of North Africa, which had been was ancient Christian territory. I mean, some of our greatest saints came from Africa, right? Saint Augustine, many of the councils of the church were held, in these areas, in certain areas in North Africa, or in modern day Turkey, for example, councils of Nicaea. And, most of that territory was never liberated, if you will, right? The Holy Land was, and about a 600-mile frontier along the coast of what is now, Lebanon's and Israel, was liberated in Turkey, was liberated, but it didn't last very long. It only, for example, the First Crusade was the only fully successful crusade, and it did liberate the Holy City of Jerusalem in the summer of 1099. But Jerusalem was only fully under Christian control for 88 years. Soon thereafter, in the 12th century, it was once again taken over by Islamic forces, by Saladin. So, it wasn't lasting, which leads to my other point that you brought up about, are the Crusades really the source of this modern day tension between Islam and the West? And that was used as an example, right? Or people were trying to just explain, why did these attacks in 2001 happen? And as you mentioned, Bill Clinton and others floated this idea that, it was because of the Crusades. It was the Islamic memory of the horrible things that the Westerners did to Muslims during the Crusades. And that's completely false, right? I mean, the first actual history of the Crusades in Arabic didn't appear until 1899. The Crusades themselves were not at all an important part of Islamic history for centuries, primarily because they didn't last very long, frankly. Crusader influence and Christian influence, and any kind of permanent settlement, if you will, didn't last very long, less than a couple hundred years. And so it kind of passed out of memory. It wasn't really until you get into the in the 20th century, the mid 20th century, and into the later 20th century, where Arab nationalists and Arab and Muslim terrorists begin to utilize this perceived image of what the Crusades really were to further recruitment, to try to separate themselves from Western governments who had moved in after the First World War and as part of the Second World War as well, to really establish colonial enterprises in these areas of the world. And it was a reaction to those that kind of brought this negative image of the Crusades into the Muslim mind, which hadn't been there for centuries, or hadn't been there at all, really.
Okay. And thanks for that, Steve. At least we have something to get us started when it comes to the crusade. And for more of that, I encourage people to read your book, Glory of the Crusades.
Hi, this is Jay Aruga of the Jay Aruga Show. If you like what you just saw, please consider subscribing and smash that like button. We'll need all of your help to take back the culture from this ideological colonization of the West. Thank you.